now I'm here and I'm hearing about this fantastic project and all Paolo's work and the wonderful team that he has with him, so I'm glad. What I've tried to do is actually not just give the paper that I would have given, but try to think actually what really would be most useful for a project on migration and homemaking. So instead what I've done is I've sort of gone through different projects that I've done in the past and tried to kind of look at the different elements that I thought might contribute to a discussion of basically your project. And hope that that then sort of comes together in some kind of way. Some of it is just discussing projects, and there's 2 or 3 stories which I will also kind of read out at different parts. And as I said, initially most of my interest was in the field of material culture studies and looking very carefully at arrays of objects. So I'm going to start off simply by getting a sense of the kind of stuff that I used to work on and kind of what I used to do with it. And this is material actually from Trinidad, which is probably where I've worked more than anywhere else, over a series of different projects. And the point being that if you look at this slide and then the next slide, so between that kind of maroon-based and these kind of orange-based, I would think in the areas where I was working, maybe 90% of the home interiors would have one or other of these basic kind of colour schemes, and after a very short time you start to get a sense of the kind of normative patterns. You see a lot of these flower decorations, but only ever artificial flowers. You see a lot of kind of lace work of different kinds, a lot of layering of different kinds. Next, please. You see, okay, here for example, the Christmas cards that are out, even though this is actually not during Christmas time. You get these dresses full of different kind of orders. One thing to note is these are not kind of valuable things. They're just very much everyday sorts of ornaments. And the next, please. This is called a space saver, which is clearly the last thing that it actually is. But it is used to display, for example, often educational qualifications, family material, and again these kind of little ornaments. Next, please. I then relate this quite closely to the festival of Christmas, because I think Christmas is very much the celebration of things to do with the home interior. And in Trinidad, living rooms, there's a lot of changes around Christmas and specific decorations of Christmas. And next, please. Again, as you can see here, everything there is kind of Christmas related. The next, please. So you start to see certain themes, like I was curious about the fact that so many of the things are still in their original wrapping, and you see that again in the next one, as in here. So if we take all this kind of material, firstly, it's easy for an anthropologist because it's very normative, you get the same thing again and again and again. And gradually you start to tease out the sort of sets of values that seem to be encompassed by this material. And in particular here they seem to be to do with trying to build a home, and where a home represents kind of longevity, a lot of, as I said, layering, packaging, keeping things kind of safe. The sense that they've related to this for a very sort of long time. It's to do with intergenerational, so it's things to do with families, to do with education, etc. And it's celebrated in Christmas. But it only makes sense, at least in Trinidad, if you understand that there's a whole other side of values which have to do with the street, have to do with the festival of Carnival, which is the street-based festival, and have to do with transience, because Carnival things mustn't be the same. Now, even if you do it, you perform the same thing, you change it. So gradually from this you tease out a whole kind of cosmology of values, in which on the one side to do with transience and change against this kind of rootedness and stability, and then that becomes a much wider book about the nature of cosmology, essentially all values that you can see mapped out in Trinidad. And in my book I later on relate this, I think you can go to the next slide please, to, got this one. Not just in Trinidad, but a lot of other areas. The Last Supper is very common, essentially because it represents sort of common living, eating together and those kinds of values of family, etc. Not necessarily much to do with the original. Next, please. It's because you know the lyrics of Bob Marley songs, and I'm sure people do, and the yards, and almost one can get a romantic idea of the yards. But living actually in the yards in Kingston was in many ways a pretty miserable existence. Very violent, very difficult, very poor. And actually the main way people escaped from the yards was actually to populate this area, which was probably the largest new area of housing, next please, in the Caribbean. And the way the government did it was they produced housing extremely cheaply. They actually produced these things which were called quads. And quads are cheap because they have no foundations, they're made in the same way as car parts, and it's effectively 4 units stuck together, so you only have to do plumbing in the middle and that serves all 4 units. It's about the most basic house you could imagine, but it's therefore something that people in the Jamaican yards could actually afford to possess if they wanted to move out of there into the sort of wider part of, if you like, suburban Kingston. But the key point really is that from that, people start to develop homes, as they traditionally always have in Jamaica, when they can. The idea of the home is not something you build. The home is something that gradually accumulates whenever you get a bit of money. So the tradition in Jamaica, you've got a job for a year, so you can build an extra wall or a cellar or something, and then it's just left, possibly even half built if you've lost the job, until the next bit of income comes in, you build a bit more, etc., etc. So if you start with that, next slide please, you build on a bit maybe onto the side, the next slide please, but after a while, you would never know that this house starts as a quad, right? By the time you've got kind of Grecian columns, and the second floor, and gradually things are going better in your life, and I think there's another one in the next slide, okay, you could start with a quad and you can end up there. And that of course is precisely the suburban ideal or that people came into Portmore in the first place. Next slide please. Okay, but the point about this is that building a home has here wider significance in the same way that, as it were, decorating the home did in the Trinidadian case. Building the home is a life project, and it is the key idiom for actually understanding what life itself is all about. And I think one of the best ways of seeing that, which is kind of curious in terms of the way we would see Christianity, is that Jamaica is a very, very Christian island, very staunchly Christian. Not of Pentecostals. And yet, right up until now, most people have children before they get married. And there is anything the church really doesn't approve of, it's having children before marriage. So despite all this, if it were heavy-duty Christianity, for now a considerable period, Jamaicans just will not have children before marriage. They have children when they can build a house. Then you get married and they've already had children. You get married when you have a house because it makes no sense for them to be married, call yourself married, if you don't actually have the house to live in. So gradually people accumulate this life project in which the other things, like getting married, take their place in that kind of trajectory. Now this becomes interesting when you start to look at it in the situation of migration, because Heather's PhD thesis was actually about Jamaicans who had been into England but migrated back into Jamaica. And what he basically found was that the idea had been that you would come to England, make your fortune as it were, with some money, etc., and then retire back into Jamaica, and certainly because your income tended to be a good deal higher if you're working in National Health Service, you could build a big house in Jamaica, and often they went, in fact, not necessarily to the place they'd come from, but to the uplands of Jamaica, and built these larger houses. But the problem was that having spent decades in England, not being seen as properly English because they came from the Caribbean, the returning migrants back to Jamaica were actually called English by the Jamaicans who hadn't left and not seen as properly Jamaican. And indeed, what they found was they were not particularly respected, subject to a lot of theft, a lot of fights about land rights, etc., and not really fully able to reintegrate themselves into Jamaican society, and also their values were ambiguous, as in the homes themselves were often ambiguous, with nice English gardens, etc., in this kind of upland area. And what you find is that, they're already quite elderly. They tend to gravitate more to, again, back into a strong form of Christianity, but also, as they're getting older and people start to die, you get very considerable wakes, and a lot of people are spending actually a considerable amount of time in activities associated with funerals and wakes and this kind of activity. But eventually, when they themselves die, and they are buried in the area, they are very likely to have a grave that looks like that. And indeed, not only a grave that looks like that, but some of these graves often have the ironwork around them that you would find in an ordinary domestic house. Okay? So here we have a situation where you can only finally make your homecoming, right, your homemaking, in death. And that is very clearly symbolised in the material culture of death. When you make your gravestone your final house, as indeed, or kind of symbolically, your house in heaven. Now, I'm going to read a story now, because I want to, you've seen it in abstract terms, and I want to see how this feels from the point of view of a particular individual. And again, this is a story coming out of Company of Things, apologize if you've read it before, but it's about Mrs. Stone. And Mrs. Stone first came to settle in London in 1956, and to this house in Stewart Street where I worked in 1958. The house has the feel of one long inhabited by a family. It's lost any pretension to any architectural or decorative style, rather than echoes back the intense network of family relations of which Mrs. Stone is now the apex, having 23 grandchildren, and while we were visiting her, her first great-grandchild. The house is occupied by two main classes of material. Either those such as books, music and pictures that relate to her Christian faith, and the other an abundance of photographs and cards that represent her extended family. Mrs. Stone talks to us at length about weddings and holidays and trips to Jamaica and the doings of her grandchildren. For the birth of her first two children, Mrs. Stone returned to Jamaica, where her own mother supervised the arrangements. Then she did not return for over a decade, and her next four children were born in London, after which she started to visit Jamaica on at least an annual basis, and has now made some 30 return trips. In 1987, she decided to return permanently to Jamaica, to a house she built in Christiana, which is my pseudonym for the place where actually a lot of these returnees do go, in the middle of Jamaica. One of the coolest and highest sites in the island. It's more like England, right? She was not alone, and many of the people from this area said had gone there. But she was also not alone in her experience of the failure of this enterprise. In her case, the result was primarily the difficult relations she experienced with her first husband and his relatives in Jamaica. Eventually, in 1991, when she felt she had enough of all the quarrelling that was going on, she just took a single suitcase, a few clothes, left her husband, and returned to the house, which fortunately they hadn't yet sold, in London. So one might think that would be enough, but the project of making a home in Jamaica had ended in failure. But Mrs. Stone could not abandon the project of making her home in Jamaica. Since 1991, she'd been in court in dispute with her first husband over the house in Jamaica and the one in London. 2005, when this was resolved, the first thing she did was take the money she'd received from that settlement to build another house back in Jamaica. But almost everything about this was full of contradiction. She'd recently been to an Ideal Home exhibition in London, where she had fallen in love with some very expensive Italian furniture. She was Italian, which she'd purchased for her new house in Jamaica. Yet the house in London is entirely furnished with very modest materials that nowhere match what she's now building in this new Jamaican home. As I said, it's not a particularly Jamaican tradition to do this anyway. So she describes the house she's been building. She says, the two lounges, one is upstairs, one is downstairs, 3 en suite, You just go into your bedroom and that's it. Everything is in there. Your bathroom and stuff. The ground floor has a master bedroom and an ensuite and a powder room. It's got space. You can put what you want where you want. There's a garage, as you can see. There's a door that takes you right in front of the garage into the house there. You've got a kitchen, a long kitchen there and the one upstairs. This is the house for her new Italian furniture. And you can start to see the contradictions, because the real contradiction, though, is that she cannot match this continuity of commitment to the house with any personal commitment to actually living there. Because then she says, well, you know, with her new husband, there's the problem of the National Health Service in England, she thinks is wonderful. And, you know, you're going to start getting ill, and it's a risk if you go somewhere that doesn't have the same quality of healthcare, and doesn't have the National Health Service, and you can't get that nowhere, she says, not even in America. Here is the best. She also has, of course, a personal affection by now for England, notwithstanding the prejudices she suffered from during the early years. He says, I can't give up England. I think it's because I spent all my other years in England, so it's not easy. I'd have to come running back. Everything is just going to be running back to Britain, running back to my home, to my mother country. That's what it is, you know. Yes, run back to my mother country, by which he means England, not Jamaica. As a result, she's now built a house, but it's completely unclear what to do with it. He says, oh yes, I've got to be buying stuff to get. When I was up there, because we went up there, the person who was looking after the house, he told me the house is sort of nearly finished and everything. And what do I want to do with it? Because it's got to be occupied, because people might just, you know, basically steal. So he said, what to do? What do I want to do with it? Do I want to rent it? And I said, no, I don't want to rent it. I want to go to my house. So I'll have to take care of that. So in the end, she decides her brother can live in it. So for now, she's in this bizarre position. She's paying the electricity, the taxes, but she's got no prospect of actually living. I think he knows she's not actually ever going to live there. Now, funnily enough, there's not an object in the London house that I can recognise as having coming back from Jamaica. Mrs. Stone explains that it would be pointless having souvenirs given house because she is there. Furniture only ever travels in the other direction. Mainly what she brings back and distributes amongst her family is Jamaican food, items such as tamarind balls, which even if you do find them in London are really not as good as the homemade ones in Jamaica. So Mrs. Stone is living in one home, but feels strongly the pull of two other ideal homes. One in Jamaica, but one in heaven. She's always aware that beyond the everyday secular life there is another where one's heart and soul must dwell. Although this living room has plenty of books and music, not one of these is secular. Similarly, all the decorations on the wall are not family photographs of religious images. Mrs. Stone plays the organ at her local church, and many of her family attend church every Sunday. When the new house was finished in Jamaica, the most important task was to organise for its blessing. This was arranged in Jamaica through the local church and Returnee Residents Association. She played the organ and fed around 40 guests for a ceremony which inaugurated the house as a proper, that is, blessed house. So, what I'm arguing basically is, having described this in more abstract terms, the way the Jamaicans create a project of a house that essentially is the sort of quintessential icon of just their life and the life trajectory, and it ends in a home in heaven, materialised in the grave. The same would be true. The contradictions, and you can see how many contradictions there are in Mrs. Stone's life and Mrs. Stone's homemaking and where Mrs. Stone's home might be, are only ever going to be resolved there. When she's buried in Jamaica, which she will be, and in a gravestone of that kind. Okay, so my work for a long period of time was based essentially around these analyses of material culture, but as most of you will know, since then I have also migrated from concentrating essentially on offline material increasingly to online material. And actually, one of the pieces of work that really assisted in this, when you think about the subject of homemaking, was another piece of work also done by Heather Horst, who was no longer at that point a PhD student. In fact, wasn't. She did the work together with me. She now lectures in Sydney. And she was starting to look also at online material, actually doing a project in Silicon Valley in the US. And at that time, relatively early on, The main platform that most young people used anyway was MySpace. And MySpace was a bit different from things like Facebook that came later on, because it was much more amenable to transformation by the actual owner of the particular, it was called MySpace. You decorate MySpace, as in here is the online, if you like, decoration. And what he noticed was that when you looked at young, say, teenagers, right, in these houses in California, and you asked the question, where do these teenagers live? Then they have a room in the house. But that room is as separate as it can possibly be from the rest of the house. There's usually going to be a sign on the door saying things like, you know, parents and other uncool people do not enter, right? And that is their own space with their posters of whatever it would be, basketball and rock, celebrities, etc. But then, increasingly, they also have an online space which they're coming to through their computer screen, and which in those days was a MySpace space. And what Helen found was actually there was a continuity of aesthetic between the offline room of those teenagers and the online space of MySpace, because you could choose the colour of your MySpace space, right? So if they had green in the one, they kind of had green in the other. So as far as the teenagers were concerned, they were creating essentially a dual space in which they now lived, in which they were using an aesthetic to create continuity between the offline portion of where they lived and the online portion of where they lived. So with that in mind, I'm going to give the third and last of my stories, which is this time about an adult from Trinidad called Dr. Karamath. At least in my book he is. And this comes from, by the way, Heather Horse, I should mention, that article comes from a book that I edited called The Individual in Anthropology. This story comes from a book of mine called Tales from Facebook. Okay, so, Dr. Karamath. Dr. Karamath is a distinguished expert on human rights. He had spent much of his life travelling as a Caribbean representative to many international forums. In his 60s, however, Dr. Karamath suffered from a serious injury, such that from now on he will always be housebound in Trinidad. He actually cannot leave his house. But then using Facebook, bit by bit, Dr. Karamath replicated exactly the kinds of networking relationships that he had fostered before his illness. He soon found that even for someone with as international and cosmopolitan experience as himself, who had met so many people in so many lands, Facebook could take this whole operation up a gear. He could now be in contact with yet more people in yet more countries, and far more effectively than had ever previously been the case. Before, it had mattered that this friend was in Washington and that one was in Toronto, and there were the weary overnight flights and the cold, alienating waitovers in airports to negotiate, as many academics will recognise, but not anymore. On Facebook, he could simultaneously be in many countries. He developed new transnational friendships with people who have similar interest in politics, but also a specific art form. So the group of people he is cultivating start because when they're online, they see what is there in the background in the rooms, and they start commenting on it and like it. And he had a collection of agitprop posters from Russia, those sort of political posters. They were fashionable in, I guess, the 70s. They were fashionable here. I'm sure they 80s, I'm sure, Bologna or something. Russian posters, right? And then some of his friends started to copy those and make their own collections. So, just as we've had in the MySpace teenagers, you've actually here got people in their 60s creating a sort of set of common aesthetics that they act as the background to things like Skype conversations, where they can discuss their latest purchases, okay, because there is a common collective aesthetic and collecting aesthetic between these various peoples. Okay, so And it was clear that his coterie of friends had a good knowledge also of artworks, prints and paraphernalia in their respective homes. So it seemed as though Facebook, with its complementary cousins, Skype and webcam, had managed somehow to replicate the older circuit of cocktail parties in which each had in turn hosted the group. So the decorations of the home would still create an ambiance that helped generate productive conversation and friendship. So what I tried to do in these two cases is help us move from offline to online, but move gently. Move with continuity in that sense of the analysis of the material, culture and aesthetics, because actually it's just as instrumental to these cases of online as it is to offline. But now I want to do two more kind of pairings, as it were, to explore other elements that I would think are important in this general project of homemaking. We were talking yesterday and saying that, actually, if I was talking about homemaking, really, for this, as in almost everything else you study, at the core are your core relationships. And it's very hard to think about something like home, domesticity, etc., outside of the context of other terms like motherhood. And what the place, role, nature of motherhood would be in the creation of this sense of the domestic. And I want now to talk a little bit about a project that was essentially based around understanding the construction of motherhood as kind of homemaking. But before that, I will point out that the group that I'm going to be talking about, Filipinas, are sometimes one of the strongest examples of people who have seized upon the possibilities of new online relationships at the expense of offline. So that a friend of mine who I knew very well worked in a care home in London. And I realised that she'd been there for about 2.5 years. But as far as I knew, she had never been to a film in London. She had never been to a pub in London. She lived in a room with bunk beds with fellow Filipino workers. Basically, London was where she slept. London was where she worked. London was where she ate. But all the rest of the time, she is basically online. First with Friendster, because Friendster was very important to Filipinos at the time. And later that became, after about 2012, it became more Facebook. So when you ask the question, where does she live? It's very hard to see the offline as an appropriate answer. It's really much more online, and I'm going to say more about that kind of later on. So in that situation, now she didn't, as it happened, have children, but most of the Filipinos who came to work in London and Cambridge, who worked in both areas, had actually had children before they left the Philippines. And therefore, I teamed up with somebody who also worked on media. Her name is Mirka Mariano. And together, we tried to set up a project, and the question really was this. We knew that these mothers had been separated from their children sometimes for 10 or 15 years. We also knew that they had not really been able to afford to go back, except very, very rarely, to the Philippines. It was just too expensive. And also during much of that period, the only real communication you had was letter writing, because even when phone calls came in, phone calls were very expensive. So it had largely developed letter writing, which meant that the contact they'd had with their children during almost the entirety of that childhood was very attenuated. So the question we had was this: when into that situation you get all this new media and it becomes very, very cheap and very accessible, can you, in effect, become a mother again? How far can new media in and of itself create a mother? And what does that tell you about A, the nature of motherhood, and B, what does it tell you about the nature of new media? That's why we were studying this. And what we did was first, we got to know quite a lot of Filipinas in London and Cambridge. Mirka was more in Cambridge, where she lives, in London. Pretty much split between people working more in the health service, who are actually a bit better off, probably most of the people, at least most of the people I worked with, were in domestic work. So they were essentially cleaners or people living inside people's homes, cleaners looking after children, and actually pretty low paid. So we would discuss at length with them what they understood as the result of this radical transformation in their ability to get back in touch with their children. But what we then did is we came to the Philippines and we tried to track down the children of those people that we knew in London. So that we ended up with 20, as it were, pairs, where we knew the mother and we also knew the children. And this is published in a book called Migration and New Media. See it. And to cut a long story short, what the mothers almost always said was, yes, thanks to the new media, I feel I am a mother again. Before I had a letter writing, now I can send 20 emails, text, well actually Philippines is always texting, today it's possibly WhatsApp. A day, I can be in touch with them, find out how they are, make sure they're okay, see what's happening when they're going out, when they're going out with, when they're getting back, etc., etc., etc. I feel like I am, thank heavens, I'm now a mother again. When you went to talk to the children in the Philippines, there was much more of a split in the response. And probably more than half would have said no. Actually, what happened was that there was then suddenly all this evidence about how much our mothers are distant from us. Because, for example, they started sending us lots of gifts and things, but they were always for people at a lower age than we actually are. They couldn't get it that we're. And similarly, all this 50 texts a day, for us that's surveillance. It's like they're asking when I'm going out, who am I going out with? Text them when I get back into the house. How old do they think I actually am? You know, and do I want this surveillance from somebody I basically not known for most of my childhood? So actually, for them, it was a much more ambivalent, if you like, ambiguous kind of relationship that was being developed through the new media. So the first half, as it were, is the question of can you become a mother through the new media? The second is really what that tells you about the nature of media. I don't have time to go into it, but we're developing these concepts like polymedia, how people use the relationship between the different media alternatives they have available to, for example, develop things like power relations, where the children are more powerful on one, the parents are more powerful on the other, and each wants to have the media where they are, as it were, more in control. So what we're adding now to this issue of homemaking is perhaps the most central relationship, the nature of motherhood itself, as a core to what people would understand by domesticity and the home. So the next pairing, I want to add a different dimension to your task, as it were. And this essentially was material that came about through a study of webcam and Skype, which was published as a book called Webcam, and was published in 2014, and it's a book I wrote with Janina Sinderman, who actually is based in Melbourne, but it's work we did together in Trinidad. Where we're trying to understand what is the implications of using increasing use of Skype and webcam. All of you, because I'm sure you all have a fairly transnational, domestic, if not other life, would be very familiar with. And one of the things that struck me quite early on when I was doing this work is I got a hunch. It's hard to say what exactly is evidence here. But we're starting with quite a lot of couples, separated couples. I mean, often the students whose other partner was, say, back in Trinidad or back and forth, etc. And what I started to notice as you listen to these accounts was actually there's two very different ways of using webcam. One is that you sit on your side looking at the screen and your partner sits on their side looking at the screen, and essentially webcam is telephone with visuals. And that seemed the normal way, the obvious way to use webcam when it first came in. It's basically telephone with visuals. However, after after it became more stable as a platform and people became more used to it, they started a different kind of usage, which we tend to refer to as always on, in which actually you don't sit in front of your webcam, you have the webcam there, but one of them might be cooking in the kitchen. Another one might be watching TV. They're not necessarily talking to each other, but the webcam is, in a way, it's replicating the sense of co-presence in a home. And my hunch was, after a few of these, I got the feeling that the couples that used it like a phone with visuals seem less likely to survive as couples than the ones who used it as always on. Because the couples were using it like a phone, you tended to feel this kind of pressure. The pressure is that you are always having to talk to each other. And it's like, oh, my partner has stopped speaking. I can't think what to say next. Does that mean we're not in love anymore? Or we're a bad couple? Or how can I not have something to say to my partner? So the pauses become actually quite difficult and embarrassing, and you start reflecting it, and there's an awkwardness. And the point being that couples normally don't spend their entire time talking to each other. Actually, when one lives together in a house, the key point is to actually organise it so there is quite a lot of autonomy between the respective people. And this is why I think this project is interesting for this project of homemaking. Because what you realise is that making a home as a couple is actually just as much about ensuring forms of autonomy and silence and sufficiency in the co-presence of couples as it is of actually creating the basis of communication between the members. Think back to the teenager who has completely their own room, all right? So making a home can be confused with making a constancy of sociality. Actually, making a home is creating a balance of forces between being together and sort of together. So clearly what was missing, I think, in a lot of studies of the domestic and the home was a proper analysis of how co-presence actually operates in the normal home, the one that doesn't have webcam. Because there isn't so much of that kind of gospel sense of the senses of awkwardness and togetherness, and couples who possibly don't even like each other after a certain period of time, nevertheless sharing space in these houses. And how do they organise space to do that? And space can become quite complex. Even if you do get together, interpreting space becomes complex. So you go into a house and there's a bedroom and another bedroom, and you're thinking, well, do they sleep apart or do they sleep together, this couple? And then you realise actually they have a routine where they always go to bed together, possibly have sex for possibly unromantic reasons, it's the best way of going to sleep. And then, but he snores. So after an hour, she's going to leave and she needs the other bedroom to go in. Right? So it's those kind of intimacies and issues. Again, when do you be together? When do you have autonomy? And how that's reflected in the organisation of the domestic space that is actually central, I think, to homemaking. But the point is, and this is true, I think, of a lot of the stuff that we do in digital anthropology. I've always argued that one of the importances of digital anthropology is not to understand the latest, if you like, gimmick in the use of new media, but the way new media as a form of mediation alerts you to the existence of prior forms of mediation that have always existed. As I said in my introduction to digital anthropology, I do not believe human society is becoming more mediated. To me, that's a nonsense for an anthropologist. Human relations have always been totally mediated, it's just the forms of mediation change. So, in a way, looking at the new ones alerts you to the nature of older ones that we have simply taken for granted because they were so kind of ubiquitous. And we just did, it's that sense that what's in front of your nose is what you're blind to. what you don't see. Okay. But because I'm out of time, I'll end with one final example. And for this, probably lights and this again. Okay. Thank you. So the last example will bring me up to the project I've been doing the last 5 years. I don't have time to talk about the project in the next 5 years. Anyway, the project I was doing the last 5 years, most of you know, has been about the study of social media. And in terms of the study of migrants, one of the things about this study, which consisted of 9 simultaneous ethnographies each of 16 months, one of those studies was of what has probably been the largest migration in the whole of human history. And that migration consists of 250 million people who over the last few decades have moved from the Chinese countryside into the Chinese factory system. It's a vast migration into the factory system. And the book that is about that, which will come on later, really starts by trying to understand the nature of that migration, but then after a while turning into what might be called a dual and simultaneous migration. What Xin Yuan Wang did was she lived inside one of these factories for the period of the 16 months. So she got to know the factory workers very, very well. And what she felt was there's 2 migrations. One is the migration from the rural area to the factory system. And actually she argues, certainly for the more recent migrants, contrary to what most people think, this is not necessarily an economic migration. They're not actually earning a lot more in the factories than they would have done if they'd stayed where they are. What they're doing is they're moving from a rural area which they felt is very conservative and isn't really symbolic of what they see as modern China, and moving towards the sort of more metropolitan spaces like Shanghai, so that they get to feel they are coming closer to this modernity of China. But it's 2 migrations, because at the same time that they're migrating from rural to urban, they are migrating from offline to online. So all of these workers have phones and internet and are constantly on, particularly then with the platform QQ, now it will probably maybe be WeChat. And what she found was that if you looked at their homemaking, your project, right, homemaking was not great when it comes to offline. A lot of these workers live in dormitories, sometimes 6 to a dormitory. They really don't have very much going on for them in terms of where they live. But, rather like the Philippine I mentioned earlier, they don't actually do much offline except work. These are traditional forms of factory lines. They're often standing there literally in a sort of conveyor belt system, working long hours, after which, they sleep there, they eat there. They don't make they don't make many friendships with their fellow workers. They're fed up, It's not really a place where they're creating this new form of sociality. Offline. Offline is just where you live, where you work, where you eat. What they do devote themselves to, however, next slide please, is online. So one of the factory worker that lived in the top left dormitory that you saw earlier, that's where she lives, right? She is a bride, she is a princess, she is actually cultivating a whole aesthetic of what she can wear and who she can be, etc., etc. If you like, a fantasy world, or is it a real world? But it's certainly a world that is very different from her offline occupation in this kind of dormitory as a factory worker. And in a way, what Xin Yuan is arguing is that the 2 migrations have the same purpose. They are trying to take you from a conservative rural area into being part of the modernity of China. But of the 2 migrations, which is successful? Which brings them to the home that they want to be in? Is it the migration to the factory, or is it the migration online? And you can, as they say, see where I'm going with this, with the next slide please. Her argument is very strongly that it is the second migration, the migration from offline to online, that actually brings them to the place they want to be. So, the point is that there is the places they might live in, and again, the top two are places where migrant workers actually live. But you could call them the virtual homes. The homes, because they don't really have much sense of reality for these people, in as much as they're just places they happen to be sleeping in, and they don't really have very much to do with otherwise. The place where they actually live, where they spend their time cultivating and developing relationships with other people and comparing things. And often, remember, in Chinese online, you're often paying for these things. So there's also, creating avatars, and etc., etc., etc. This is where they live. Here is where they have quite literally made their home as online presences. And I'm sure they would certainly be the ones who would want to argue that their real home is here and their virtual home is up there. Okay, so, as I've gone over time, to conclude, what I've tried to do is answer the question you put to me, which is how one can contribute to thinking about this project of migration and homemaking. And in order to do that, I've tried to look, A, at different parameters that seem to me to come into the question. So it can be core relations like motherhood, it can be the nature of co-presence within the home, it can be the material culture of the home, or indeed, increasingly, it can be online as much as it is offline. And in all of these, you see, I think, interesting contradictions and the potential for getting things wrong. Because as, to go back in my very first instance, when you look at these outside of the context of knowing both the different places that are involved here, it can be offline as well. One of the points is we never study online without understanding offline. We've always resisted the notion of an online-only ethnography. Unless you see the juxtaposition between the different spaces and their different histories, etc., it's very difficult to interpret this. And I would also say it would be difficult to interpret it from just talking to people. All of this stuff has a very strong aesthetic, and that's why I think material culture is the right way to approach online things, by not thinking of it as virtual, but by thinking of it as a different form of materiality with its own aesthetic. And a lot of what is going on only becomes evident when I think you're all kind of staring in the face. So you have to complement, I think, the verbal presentation of what's going on with the practices, with what these people are actually doing, which increasingly is this. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Johnny. Lots of thoughts here. So, maybe can you start?
Sure, yeah. Well, first I want to thank Jane for quite an expansive and interesting talk. I'm not going to do any service to it by my few questions here, but I'll see what I can do. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is, if we think maybe 30 years ago, the anthropologist Grant McCracken could write in the Journal of Consumer Research that if we thought about writing about consumption, there wasn't much going on in the field of consumption. There was McKendrick, there was Brodel, but then there wasn't much else. And then what we can say in the last 30 years is, thanks mostly to your pioneering work, consumption has become sort of a central focus for anthropologists. So I have a few questions I want to ask you, or I want to phrase after I kind of try to schematize a little bit of what I drew out of your talk. And I guess in many ways, especially when we're talking about in the context of migration, which is this home project, there's three areas that I'm pulling out from your presentation and the interesting ethnographic material you pulled out for us. And the first one is temporality, and how important time plays through this context. Obviously, the other one is spatiality, space. And the third is the person, and how we think of the person, how the person is constructed through the kinds of refashioning that is possible through material culture, and the kinds of ways in which individuals use material culture to try on forms of personality, try on forms of belonging, to try on different kinds of selves, if you will. I'm not going to spend too much time on space, although I think space was clearly a key thread through most of this, especially when we're talking about homes. And maybe I'll get to it a little bit later when I ask a question about the webcam and the online-offline distinctions. But I want to just talk a little bit about time, because time, when we think about time with consumption and material culture, the thing about time is it seems to be something that is increasingly divided. There's a possibility for thinking about a kind of periodicity associated with fashion, with culture, with consumption. And we saw that in some ways through some of the discussions about the Jamaican women and their connections through material culture back to, or their disconnections through material culture back to where they had migrated from, and then their settlements into London. So in some way, the present becomes more narrow in some of the things we're talking about. But when we have to think about periodicity, it's not linear. And that's the most exciting thing I think about migration studies, is how so often we're playing with different kinds of temporalities all at once, because people are trying to cope with their recollections and their ongoing relationships in other spaces that are connected to their other times, and reinvent or reconstitute those spaces through material objects in these new contexts, or denying those particular forms of material objects because they're so much connected to places of particular places and particular times. And so I think temporality provides us with a very good perspective on kinds of the challenges of homemaking, kinds of the challenges associated with what forms of material culture can best represent my connection to another place, from another time, in either the past or in the future, that I'm trying, or in the present, obviously, that I'm trying to construct. The other brilliant thing, of course, which I enjoyed about your talk, is not once a mention of moral failings. When we're thinking about material culture, how often it's so easy, all you have to look in is the media, is how much material culture is connected to this idea that somehow consumption is a sign of moral failings. But in fact, I think it's quite demonstrated quite clearly that consumption is an aspect of moral order and moral striving, a way in which to kind of create a certainty, a sense of belonging, a sense of trajectory of sociality, as you mentioned. So that's what I want to say about time. I just want to ask a couple of questions about the offline, online, especially the issue around the webcam. And so you had these two distinctions about the sort of the face-to-face conversations and that sort of reproduced almost what a telephone conversation would be like, only with video added. And then the other one was the always-on, as if this family are coming in and out of frame because you're still in the same co-presence in the same space. I guess I had two questions about that. One is there a third, and maybe that's not yet possible, or in your research it hadn't quite come out, what I might call the GoPro version, where you're with that person wherever they are, so that it's not a set webcam or a set computer site, but you're I guess you're paragliding with them, or you're at a festival with them, or there's this kind of intensified co-presence that is beyond that kind of space of the home. And then the other question that came to me, and I guess I want you to see if you can pull this up for us a little bit more, because it has profound effects for us anthropologists trying to figure out, constantly trying to struggle between the universal and the particular, is the way you were talking about space as this balance of autonomy in space. And I was trying to think about what kind of person you were talking about, and how, as researchers, and I know this project is dealing with a series of communities from different parts of the world who have very different understandings of physical space, of bodies, of expectations about being together and being separate. So how do we think about, how do we get at this kind of variation in autonomy, I guess? Because I know in a brief talk you have to be restricted, but the presentation was a kind of normative sense of the person about needing that privacy. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about expanding that. And I guess I'll stop just, so that's about migration difference, I guess. And I'll just stop one brief comment. It was really interesting about the Philippines, the Philippine research you've done. And I spent a fair bit of time in Hong Kong, and perhaps you've been there too. And always on Sunday in the Admiralty is you see this construction of home. Right? You see it's their day off from working as domestics, and they set up these huge carpets with food, with all kinds of domestic goods, all kinds of letters, all kinds of sociality, creating a space where they're reclaiming a city that's not really theirs, an official part of Hong Kong. So there's a kind of physical materiality to that Philippine migration in Hong Kong, which is always
live. But, rather like the Philippine I mentioned earlier, they don't actually do much offline except work. These are traditional forms of factory lines, often standing there literally in a sort of conveyor belt system, working long hours, after which they sleep there, they eat there. They don't make many friendships with their fellow workers. They're fed up, It's not really a place where they're creating this new form of sociality. Offline. Offline is just where you live, where you work, where you eat. What they do devote themselves to, however, next slide please, is online. So one of the factory worker that lived in the top left dormitory that you saw earlier, that's where she lives, right? She is a bride, she is a princess. She is actually cultivating a whole aesthetic of what she can wear and who she can be, etc., etc. If you like a fantasy world, or is it a real world? But it's certainly a world that is very different from her offline occupation in this kind of dormitory as a factory worker. And in a way, what Xin Yuan is arguing is that the two migrations have the same purpose. They are trying to take you from a conservative rural area into being part of the modernity of China. But of the two migrations, which is successful? Which brings them to the home that they want to be in? Is it the migration to the factory, or is it the migration online? And you can, as they say, see where I'm going with this, with the next slide, please. Her argument is very strongly that it is the second migration, the migration from offline to online, that actually brings them to the place they want to be. So, the point is that there is the places they might live in, and again, the top two are places where migrant workers actually live. But you could call them the virtual homes. The homes, because they don't really have much sense of reality for these people, in as much as they're just places they happen to be sleeping in, and they don't really have very much to do with otherwise. The place where they actually live, where they spend their time cultivating and developing relationships with other people and comparing things, and often, remember, in Chinese online you're often paying for these things. So there's also creating avatars, and etc., etc., etc. This is where they live. Here is where they have quite literally made their home as online presences, and I'm sure they would certainly be the ones who would want to argue that their real home is here and their virtual home is up there. Okay, so, as I've gone over time, to conclude, what I've tried to do is answer the question you put to me, which is how one can contribute to thinking about this project of migration and homemaking. And in order to do that, I've tried to look, at different parameters that seem to me to come into the question. So it can be core relations like motherhood, it can be the nature of co-presence within the home, it can be the material culture of the home, or indeed, increasingly, it can be online as much as it is offline. And in all of these, you see, I think, interesting contradictions and the potential for getting things wrong. Because to go back in my very first instance, when you look at these outside of the context of knowing both the different places that are involved here, which can be offline as well, one of the points is we never study online without understanding offline. We've always resisted the notion of an online-only ethnography. Unless you see the juxtaposition between the different spaces and their different histories, etc., it's very difficult to interpret this. And I would also say it would be difficult to interpret it from just talking to people. All of this stuff has a very strong aesthetic, and that's why I think material art was the right way to approach online things, by not thinking of it as virtual, but by thinking of it as a different form of materiality with its own aesthetic. And a lot of what is going on only becomes evident when I think you're all kind of staring in the face. So you have to complement, I think, the verbal presentation of what's going on with the practices, with what these people are actually doing, which increasingly is this. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Jenny.